Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Tales and Tactics Beyond the Book, where we break down the core mechanics behind tabletop games. I am your host, Max, and joining me, as always, is my co-host, Troy. Not to forget our good producer, Jay, working behind the scenes, making everything work. Today's episode is about action economy, which is the hidden backbone of every game you've ever played. And in some ways, this is an extension of the initiative and activation episode, but I would say that it broadens it out and also drills down into that concept more, because we're talking about what can you do on your turn, or, you know, if you're playing solitaire, like, you can only play one card at a time. You don't get to pick between two cards. So
that's very true.
But, you know, you have to play with what's at hand, and you can only make one move. You know, there's no simultaneous movement in solitaire.
Absolutely. So the action economy of the game basically determines how many things and what kinds of things you're doing in your turn. This is essential to games. It sets up what is effectively how you approach and manipulate the contents of the game, and in what fashion you're able to do that. So, like, if you think of a unit or a character in a role-playing game, 2 actions perhaps might be the standard, and that could be taken for granted almost. Like, oh, sure, 2 actions. That's basic. We always get 2 actions. But that has massive implications on what you can do and what you have to choose to do with your actions in your available turns.
Yeah, so a lot of what we're going to be talking about isn't so much about things like turn sequence and order, so much as what you can do within a individual's turn.
Yeah, definitely.
And that can be measured in a lot of different ways. So as you said, there can be a 2-action style system. Some versions of, say, Dungeons and Dragons use a standard move action, free action, and then 5th edition sometimes has things like reactions, which have been somewhat controversial as to, like, how they actually affect the action economy. You know, is it, I don't know, balanced isn't, I've made the argument before that when it comes to role-playing games, balance is a concern so much as it doesn't interfere with anyone else's idea of fun, but also it's not a concern under the same principle. War games, similarly so, provided they're not competitive.
Right, exactly.
And board games, it probably matters the most, because board games are, with certain exceptions, almost always competitive.
Yeah, and they're like a closed system that you jump into and do the objective of in a much more, like, deliberate fashion. So they better work in a way that is well-tuned.
Well, and the fact that they are closed games as opposed to open games lends to the advantage of making that easier.
Yes.
Because you're not having to think about the fact that, like, experiences outside of the game itself are going to come into play. Unless, of course, you buy an expansion, but then it comes with its own rules. So not really an open game. As we were saying, there's this idea in Dungeons and Dragons about these action types. Yep. And a lot of it comes under the idea that you can move and do a thing. And sometimes the move can be a do a thing. And sometimes the do a thing can be a move. And then it gets a little bit blurry.
Yes.
And maybe this is just a wording thing, but I'm a bigger fan of the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing terminology of full and half actions.
Right.
Because you can take a half action to move, which takes you half of your movement, or you can take a full action to move, which doubles that, basically. And you're thinking of a half action move or a full action move, but it's reasonable to also think of it as taking 2 half action moves.
Yeah, like it's the sum of 2 half actions, so now it's a full action.
There might be other rules and terminologies, like, for instance, if I'm taking my full turn to move from point A to point B, I'm probably doing it in a slightly different way than if I were just moving half that distance.
Like a walk to a run, perhaps?
Yeah, or, you know, I might just be adjusting myself from one piece of cover to another, as opposed to, like, sprinting across an area to get to a much more distinctively different area, or trying to, like, close distance with a combatant.
Yeah, crossing a field to the woods or running at a goblin.
Yeah. There's also the free action, which, I mean, we were having a couple conversations on and off about this, but what is a free act? Like, what constitutes a free action, in your opinion?
I mean, okay, what does a potion mean to you, right? Is a potion for free, or is a potion a whole thing that you have to do and uncork and glug, 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 drink back? Like, how does that work in relation to what is fun or desirable to do with your character actions? Because that's something that, like, not all actions are equal. And you don't necessarily want to be spending your limited action economy on things that are, I don't want to say boring, but things that have less of an output on the game state, right? Like, it might be dramatic to heal at a cool time, but a lot of times you're just doing maintenance on your character. So I understand the desire to free action the hell out of a potion and just make that something you can pop and have, and you get back, like, oh, I'll get back some hit dice, right? But I much prefer when you have to actually, like, do the thing, because what my problem is there's a lot of talk about, like, immersion and feeling like the state of your character.
Oh, yeah.
But then we run up against the friction of immersion, and then we immediately abandon any pretense of it at all just to round the corner off. And it's like, in that friction is where stuff gets interesting, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the question is, when you're playing a role-playing game, is the challenge of it the fun part, or is it the achievement that's fun? And I'd say it's a bit of both.
Yep.
But I find, younger players, people newer to the hobby, people who are more familiar with competitive games are probably going to see the achievement aspect of that game. I think as people play more and they become more mature, they begin to appreciate the challenge part of it. I am a challenge junkie. I will just full disclosure. I will modify video games that I play to make them harder or give me more things to think about.
Right.
I think it's like a stress reaction where I just like giving myself problems so I don't have to think about my actual problems. But that I'm not going to psychoanalyze myself. I like that level of immersion. So for me, the idea of it doesn't make sense that drinking a potion is just this like incidental thing, because I don't understand where's the advantage or fun about that, because I want it to, like, if you thought about it cinematically, and there was a situation where you were given the hero's given a magic potion, and they're gonna at some point in the critical point of the battle drink that potion, would you want that to be something that like was so incidental that it was like loading an arrow into their bow and firing it? Or would you want it to be something where it's like, now I'm going to restore myself. Now I'm going to give myself like, strength of a giant. And also in the realistic sense that you can't drink something that fast unless it's tiny.
Right. Exactly. Like, it takes a moment. There is time and space required to do this action. And by discounting that, it also bends the vision of the world. Like, I've got 3 guys in front of me and I'm dueling with them, these bandits, right? And I'm protecting the caravan. But then I raise one finger. I'm like, wait, I will drink this. Okay, we're back. Let's go. Like, it's just weird that it has this interim moment.
Yeah, it's the other way to think about it. Or that you're somehow doing some kind of wild multitasking. Because if it's a free action in the way that, say, 3rd or 4th edition, I think 5th edition does this, might know better than me. I don't play that much of it. But the idea is that it's like, I'm drinking a potion and then I'm going to move up and hit you, right? How do you juggle those things? Like, I'm imagining one of those like foam dome beer helmets where you like have the straw going down to your mouth and you just strap the potion to the side of your head.
Very barbarian.
That's hilarious. Like, I would allow that in a paranoia game. I'd totally have an item that was just like potion beer helmet.
Potion beer helmet, yeah, for sure.
In a game that's got immersion and seriousness to it, I'm like, no, you're taking at least. So again, I don't like the idea of like move action and standard action, because I think that this is both too specific and too nebulous. Because you could say, oh well, for my move action, I'll drink this potion and I'll swing at you, because I'm taking some kind of secondary. I think that's the thing about it that I don't like, as opposed to the wolf rap style of doing it, is that standard and move actions, if you're going with that idea, and I know other games have used something similar to this, because I think it comes from the tradition of older forms of D&D having the convention that you can move and do a thing.
Yeah.
And then what a move is then gets blurred. Like, oh, can I open a door and then take a standard action? And most of the time it was yes, right?
Yeah.
It had more to do with initiative a lot of the time, especially when you get to first and second edition. But it was more understood as being like, yeah, you can move and you can attack. Sometimes only in that order, depending on who you're working with.
Right.
In the case of potions, it takes time to drink that. It should be, you know what, I honestly, I blame, this is going to be like overly simplistic because I doubt this is the case, but I'm going to use it as the pinnacle example of this. I'm going to blame Diablo for this.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, right? Just like the red orb filling back up.
No, not just, well, I mean, the red orb filling back up, but also the idea that you can just hotkey your belt.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Right? And it, like, I'm swinging, and then I just have to hit 1 or 2, and then that'll instantaneously drink the potion while I continue to spam with my main attack.
Or later Diablos, where you just hotkey to a different weapon set, and your guy just like instantly teleports into his hand a 2-handed spear that he had in his invisible backpack.
Yeah, exactly. But I would say video games more generally, because as I said, in terms of cinematic situations and in terms of realistic situations, I don't see how you get there from that into games. But video games definitely have this idea of the quick use item.
Yeah.
You know, I was talking to Jay about this, and it's like, I've seen people demonstrate like, oh, you know, you can create a vortex in the thing when you drink it. But I'm like, yeah, but then you have to know how to do that. Like, you don't just start by, you know, you have to be a pretty prolific potion user to learn a trick like that. Or at least somebody who drinks from narrow-necked bottles a lot.
Yes. I don't buy it. I don't know. Like, okay, so you can, when we think about the value of individual actions, right? Mm-hmm. Like moving we could set that as a 0 value action, right? Where it's essential, it can do good things, but it can also be a utilitarian action as well. So let's put that at a 0. Let's set attacking at a 10, because you can slay an opponent, you get to roll the bricks on the table, people get to cheer if it's good, and people get to be sad if it's bad. So that's the 10. Maybe these restorative actions, like taking a potion or having to take, second wind, right? Maybe those are like a -5 quality. And then a -10 would be like, oh gosh, I got to pass my death saves, right? But it's like actions have value. So when you think about when players are given the choices to spend them, you almost want to give them like a net positive result when they have spent all their cumulative actions for the turn. And that can take the shape of just giving someone more actions, right? Like if you look at Pathfinder 2nd edition, they just give you 3 actions instead. There's like, oh, you have 3, have more fun. And that's like,
and that's more like an action point system in a lot of ways.
Except getting
that
there.
The action points are just capped at 3.
But it is effectively doing that same principle where you're spending like resource points to activate these different things that cost between 1 to 3 resource points effectively, right? Then they just call them actions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the half and full action because it has the intuitiveness of that 2-step action, but it literally just divides it based on length of time. So in that case, if you want to use the potion example, it's a half action to drink a potion. Right? Because you have to get it out, uncork it, drink it, but you could feasibly move while you're doing that. It might make it more difficult, or maybe you could do that if you were swinging a one-handed weapon.
You could fend someone off for a second?
Drinking a potion and using a 2-handed weapon? How does that work?
Very good question. Like a crossbow, like where's your beer helmet again, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there are these considerations that make the thing more interesting, it makes those ideas more meaningful in a lot of ways. I keep thinking about how video games do this, because like say in like a Final Fantasy game, you can use a potion of healing on another person. Like, and it just looks like you're using it on, like you're using one character to activate a potion on another character. I don't know that works in every game, Hilariously, in Final Fantasy Tactics, the chemists have the throw ability, so technically they're like bombing people with healing.
100%.
That makes me think that in Final Fantasy, they're more like gas clouds. Like you're like throwing like essentially healing tear gas at people.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But what does it mean though, right? Like, what is the abstraction actually roundabout meaning? And like, I like when we have an action economy that relates to physical verbs. So that's why I don't mind a 3-step process like what Pathfinder does, even though Pathfinder has a lot of other problems. The notion that I can click, 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 and some things are 2 clicks, right? Like that works really well.
It's time oriented too, right? Like I think that was the thing that I also liked about Wolf Rap is that it's not click, 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 it's click, click, but yeah. And there is a concept of free actions, but it's usually down to things like adjusting your stance or talking,
saying stuff to each other. Yeah,
you're doing something that the rest of the featured part of you is not doing. Like you can talk, or at least to yell a short like alert or command to somebody while swinging a sword.
The way I've always done it in like GM/DM style is like you can talk as much as you want within the reasonable expectation of a round being 6 to 10 seconds, right? So you can't say a lot. But if you want to say something that is like requiring of a dice roll, such as an intimidation or something, that is one of your actions now, right? Because you're like committed to having that as your impact on the game state instead of a sword swing. So you're like, maybe you're swinging your sword, but you're doing it in such a way as the intimidation is the effect still within the context of that fight. And that's kind of how I've looked at using dialogue in a fight in terms of taking up actions, as if you want to use it to trigger a dice roll, it's going to sub in for perhaps the combat main action you could take. I mean, different games will actually have like bespoke ways to handle this, but that's sort of like the default that I've always fallen back to.
Yeah, I think it's sort of, I like to think of it as spotlighting. So like if you're trying to intimidate your enemy or inspire your friends by using some kind of like a magical ability would be an obvious thing because you'd be casting a spell, but like a non-magical ability, like, it also depends on how you want to go about actually doing that. Like one of my favorite things, if you're trying to intimidate your enemy, is if you like beheaded one of them, you pick up their head and throw it back at them.
Yeah.
But that takes effort, right?
Yep.
But then I would, as a GM, reward you for the creative effort that would go into that.
Yeah.
And then I would say that like whatever attempt you make to do that will get a bonus because you spent your entire action retrieving and throwing the severed head of an enemy, even if it wasn't to hit somebody.
Right. You could give them advantage on an intimidation roll, but the intimidation roll wouldn't be spoken. It would be the steps taken and the throw of the enemy's head, like it would be that whole thing.
Yeah, that'd be a full action.
It would take the whole action. And I think that's what's really important to sort of take a step back for a second is the action economy is something that's usually very fixed in a lot of games, right? I mean, there are ways to break it. Like you could time walk, in like Magic or something and like break it. But the basic idea that I see is like the action economy is supposed to be more fixed because that's where the game designer has the most influence and some of the most control over what the players are doing in the game world. However, you need to still play in the context of your situation, and it's still DM focused. Like if anything, the rule book is going to still require you to filter it to your specific scenario or scene. And I like my actions to mean specific things, but I like them as open-ended. So I really agree with you that the Whiff Wrap or the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game, the way that it handles either it being a full or a half is really satisfying because it still means something. It still triggers off of a real thing that I have done that takes both time and effort. However, it's not like heavily abstracted, heavily mystified what's happening,
It's pretty intuitive.
It is.
And it's not overly bogged down, but it allows for enough flexibility. And as I said, like Dungeons and Dragons, at least from the editions that I've played and are familiar with, they do that, but they parse that difference in a weird way that I find awkward.
When you think about like, I guess like a Call of Cthulhu game, it's more like There are combat rules, you know what I mean? There certainly are, but it's a lot more of just saying what you want to do and then applying that into the combat rules as opposed to like, here are the combat levers that I'm pulling.
It's still quite gamist in its mechanics, but it doesn't feel that way. And I think a lot of effort's gone into making it not feel that way.
Yeah, that's very true.
But then, like, you can go into other games, like we were saying, that Pathfinder verges on having like an action point system.
Yeah.
Which is something that's probably more associated with war games.
Yeah.
And probably more like skirmish games, if I'd be perfectly honest. I don't know that many other ones, like in a lot of cases, I mean, you know more about like battlefield war games, but
yeah, a lot, like there is an AP system. The classic AP system comes from WRG, basically, way back in the day. Debella Aquintanis, I'm going to say that wrong, DBA. And it's basically a D6 order roll at the start of your turn. And that's your AP for the turn. And you roll that D6. It's meant to represent command and control friction. Some games like Squad Hammer, a personal favorite of mine, you roll like 2d6, pick the higher or pick the lower depending on troop quality, and that gives you an order pool to work with. But effectively, that is your AP for the turn that is spent across activating all of your units, which take sometimes one, maybe sometimes several, depending on the specific game or unit you're playing within the Squad Hammer set. But it would be like I roll a 3. So in DBA, or a game uses an equivalent order system, I now have 3 orders, and I can spend them to brigade up and move like a related group of troops with a simplified command, or I can spend them on individuals to move them with more complicated commands. But that's my AP system. And then you go into the fixed rules of what units are allowed to do upon receiving an activation, which is a little different than some AP systems where like you're triggering components of a guy, like I don't activate a full guy. I activate his movement for 2 AP. And I don't need to do more with him, or I could, as opposed to just a one and done activation that gives you 2 steps now, so to speak.
And a lot of Lardy's games that use dice activation do something similar to that.
100%.
Taking that idea where you might only get this much out of this level of unit. I guess it's most illustrated because of the interesting cascading effect in Chain of Command, where you activating a senior unit actually gives you a lot of flexibility, but there aren't that many of them on the table. So they can then activate teams and individuals from their own pool. And the junior leaders have a similar effect, though they're more tied to their squad, and they're also limited by the number of action points effectively that they have.
Yeah, totally. No, you're absolutely right. There's kind of like a sub action point system within the dice roll command and control system, right? Like once you roll your command and control, which is your 5 if you're an elite, 6 if you're one of those guys, but you roll your 5 and then you see what you get. You then spend those as their according values allow you to, right? Like a 3 for a junior leader, a 2 for a squad, right? As per chain of command. And then once those things are activated, characters, as you indicated, get as many activations as their leadership level, between 1 to 3 typically, sometimes 4 if you're crazy. And then squads will get, as a default, I guess it's 2, but there's some they cannot do unless there's a leader. So it kind of feels more like the default move shoot, as opposed to like being able to do stuff like Overwatch or some of the more complicated sub actions that actually require leadership initiative to be spent. But that's another example, right, of how that works. I think Lardy games are some of the best examples of cool activation systems. Like you can have an activation system like bolt action, but that's just like the random sorting of who goes when. It doesn't really change it doesn't change how the guys are going to go when they go. What you choose to do with them will be contextually different based on the sequencing of the pulls. But like really, your dude's still good for 2, He's going to move and shoot, unless they're pinned. But like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
In the case of like these Lardy games, when you get the chance to activate a leader, now you're having more points in one breath, in one slice of the time wheel that you're playing through,
Mm-hmm.
And then you can spend those out in different ways. And sometimes you get suboptimal outcomes and you rely on a more junior leader to do things that you wish you could get your senior to do, but you don't have the dice outcome or the card draw to enable that person to do that. And that, the term that a lot of people love to use is friction. And that friction is where a lot of satisfaction comes in for gamers looking for something that's more, not superior, but different, more narrative and more nuanced. And I really get a lot of satisfaction out of the games that offer these, like in wargaming, like these moments where the activation sequence can break and be different and give you different runs and different like sequences, as opposed to it being as fixed as like, I'm going to do some stuff, then you're going to do an equivalent stuff, and it's back to me to do my stuff. Like, you know what I'm trying to say?
Bolt action is like it's you go, I go with a twist.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It's activated down to the unit level. So it's not like I move all my guys and then you move all your guys. That is the worst activation system.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just a primitive holdover. But yeah, side for side, you go, I go is hard to be strategic in that situation because it favors who goes first and then who goes second. Like there is a idea about taking initiative and then reacting to that initiative, and there's strategy in that. A lot of BattleTech is based around that idea that the person who wins initiative actually goes second.
Yeah.
But it really depends on how you build your game out. I think there's a lot more creative ways to play around with that. And I also one thing that you were saying that kind of stuck with me about bolt action in the way that certain things are contextual is kind of similar to the way that like Blades in the Dark doesn't have necessarily a dictated strict action economy, but depending on your position in the group, it totally changes what you can and can't do, which is a neat consideration. But it's similar to like, it's not as strictly laid out as Fabula Ultima, but it has that idea of like positioning.
Yeah.
And having certain things be more accessible to you based on being in front or the back or what have you.
You mentioned BattleTech, and I want to just hit that really quick because that seems like it has a relatively simple activation system, but there's a hook in there because as you take actions, you accumulate heat. And this is CBT, classic BattleTech.
Yeah.
You'll accumulate your heat. That's from movement of different types, using your weapons, jump jetting about, like all types of cool stuff. And once you've accumulated heat, it's going to start to cap your actions. It's going to slow your movement. It's going to impact your shooting. And it can even push you into severe penalties, including a shutdown. So to manage that, you're going to have to spend time slowing down, catching your breath, or doing deliberate actions like taking a bath to lower your heat in the lake, right?
Yep.
There will be things you'll have to do thinking about this. So again, there is a real presence in the activation of something you're grabbing onto, something that's very tangible and has a meaning. And it's like, I'm not trying to say I hate free actions, but the idea that there's something that you're literally doing makes the difference to me, because I like to look at games as the time they represent. It's meaningful to me to know how long a round is or how long a game is, because it helps me understand like what was that encounter, whether it was a chase, a sword fight, space battle. Like it helps you understand what that is actually meaning. If you know that it was a 3-hour space battle, like you're like, wow, that is a sweaty space battle. That's like the real deal right there. You know what I mean?
Well, what about like, and this comes in BattleTech, but it comes up in a lot of other things, is simultaneous actions.
Yes.
The idea that, say you're going into shooting phase, like the firing phase in BattleTech, and I hit this guy and I shoot him, but it's like a frozen moment in time where they shoot back at the same time. So they're not necessarily affected by the damage until we get to the end and calculate what damage has actually been done.
Yeah.
If I blow their ammo case, then, they still technically they could be firing from that reserve of ammo while I hit it. It just means at the end of the next turn, it's gone. Honestly, in BattleTech, it probably blew half of them off, their body off, depending on how much ammo was left.
But when we think about something, I just want to call back on something. The time, right? Like in BattleTech, your turns are not slices of adjacent time. They're overlapping sequencing of time, right? It's like you've knocked out a time block of the Battletech turn sequence, and your actions within that are kind of melted, overlapping each other because your movement is happening. And it's assumed that the combat phase is kind of a part of that movement timing, right? They don't happen one after another where the mechs like run about and then shoot. There's like, it's sort of seen almost as occurring in a sequence that's more of one thing, as opposed to it being like a lot of games where my action is the only action of this time. And then next in sequence is the next action. It is the only action of that time.
Here's a more interesting aspect of that, because not only is that particular game's action sequence not based around the idea of this one character dominating that scene necessarily,
Right.
but it's also not a blind activation like in Diplomacy, right? Like, I'm not handing my move to a referee who then looks at everybody else's moves and then sees what the collisional effect is.
Yeah, totally.
It's just assumed to also be happening at the same time. So there's very much a allowance for things that are happening at the same. This is probably why people think of it more like a narrative game than a competitive game, because while the rules facilitate you hit them and it doesn't necessarily take effect until damage is calculated, you're also not like doing it in the hardcore competitive, like I write my move down on a piece of paper kind of way. It's an open simultaneous action as opposed to a blind simultaneous action.
Yes, and there's a chance because of the initiative order for you to optimize your choices based on what's gone before you.
What other are some interesting examples? So a weird one, because I feel like we should also talk about games outside of TTRPGs and war games and stuff like that. But like the action economy of like Magic the Gathering is, well, it's very much dictated by what cards you use in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
Typically, you can play one card and then you can activate whatever necessary land you have in order to cast that, and also to activate any cards that have not been activated. But then there are cards like Time Walk where you can just get more action.
It's a really cool like unlocker.
Yeah, and some people base their decks around having the ability to either add actions or modify those things, because there's the meme of like, but I play this and therefore I can do this, 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 and this, and whatever form that joke ends up taking. The endless chained actions that come off so the other person's just standing there.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
In more sort of gamist things like, say, Gloomhaven, where you have like initiative and ability cards, and what you can do is much more dictated like a board game than it is necessarily as like an open game.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
But it has that same layout as an open game in the sense that it's a dungeon crawler.
See, one of the games that I really love, it's a war game, is called Clash on the Fringe. It's a Nordic Weasel indie war game from a couple years ago. It's really cool. Great platoon level game.
Yeah, we played it. It was good.
Yeah. It's got a lot of really cool ideas, and it's like very granular, and you're moving your individual squad members around as opposed to moving whole squads, but you still have squads as a core concept of the game and the way you activate. So it's cool. Like you activate a squad, but then every individual makes a full 1-2 activation, 2-step activation within that greater squad umbrella, and then you move on to the next, right? Mm-hmm. So that's really neat. But where I have a problem with this game is that, as far as my reading is there's no equivalent to double moving.
Like a full move. Yeah.
Exactly. So if you need to make ground and get to a destination, it is essentially deciding for you at the point of objective creation what your action economy is going to look like in terms of player choice. Because you can't like double move to make up ground that you spend engaged in a firefight, or that you spend engaged on a use action to open a crate or whatever. Like, you basically have to make full move, whatever action remaining left I'm allowed, I will do. Full move, whatever I can do now, I will. Full move, like it dictates to you how you can spend those activations because of the limitations in the verb set. And that is why that game, like I've replaced it as my primary sci-fi platoon game, just because I miss the double move.
I mean, one would have to ask why that's the case, because even in a game like Space Weirdos, you can spend it uses a 3-action system, and you can spend your entire turn to move, or similar to laser burn, you could shoot like 3 times if you want, depending on how heavy your weapon is. Can you think of any reason why, like maybe it's to control pacing? Because that's another thing to be said about the action economy of a game. I like to equate it to the pacing of a film.
Oh, that's a good point.
Right? Like, not only in the sense of like, here's how granular we break down these things, because you could do something where you use like individual action points and a lot of those individual action points, and it would be annoying because you have to keep track of it, but it would feel more simulationist, obviously. But also in the sense that the pacing of a film has more to do with those punctuated scenes. So it really is like, how important is this thing that is happening?
Mm-hmm.
When you say that they don't allow you to double move, I'm wondering if it's trying to control the pace of the game.
There are vehicles, right? So there are troops that move at accelerated movement rates relative to infantry. So it could just be the emphasis is applied on combined arms, where it's like, yeah, infantry going to be slow. You will need transports for them, or you'll need a light walker to cover that ground. Like it could be forcing you to emphasize with other elements of the tool set. Maybe that's where that comes from, right? So there could be a balance consideration behind it. It could for sure be related directly to the pacing inherent to the game, where you don't have to run to the baseline of the opponent table edge often. A lot of the times the objectives are more central, so you don't really feel like your whole game is like maxed out movement, but it still does take you basically 3 full moves to reach the center of the table from deployment. So in a 4 to 5 turn game, you're spending the majority of your time jogging towards the center of the table. And some parts of me see the heritage of that in games, and I'm like, yeah, that's fun. But a lot of me is like, I like when I can get where I need to be, do what I need to do when I'm there, and move on, and then have consequences on me that limit my actions, as opposed to being fundamentally limited in my actions. Does that make sense? Like, I'd much rather have shock slow me down that I accumulated because of the bold move I made, instead of just not being able to make that bold move at all.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand it like a different scale of game that might be considered in a different way. Like, I think I would have more of an allowance for the fact that you can't double move in a game that's like 6 mil.
Oh, interesting.
In the sense that at that point, infantry, and we're talking about infantry units in this case, infantry occupies a different focus in that game. Like, you're not dealing with individual units. So they might have other advantages in the way that they can blend into cover, or they don't have positioning necessarily.
That's very Battletech, like the way that infantry are not great at moving or really fighting head on, but they're basically so hard to get out of cover, and you need other infantry to effectively fight them up close. You know, like it's interesting. It's for sure a really cool way to look at them once you lens up, you know?
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying, is that lensing up leans some to our expectations of what sort of game. But I agree, if you're playing a 28 mil game that is sort of 1-to-1 scale or scoping, so like individual scoped, yeah, I'd feel weird about not having that level of flexibility.
I like to be able to run 4 inches or 8 inches, if that's my base movement rate, for example, right? I like that because it gives me the option to have, like, you know, the tactical cool crouch walk, as well as the roadie cam, remember from Gears of War, run with the bouncing camera effect, right? It gives you both of those things. It extends your tactical decision making. And for me, just because of a lot of the games I've played, I've really played a lot of infantry-focused games. I like when infantry are capable, as opposed to just being like static things. Like in Battletech, there's very good reasons for it, for the setting and for the lore and for the level of lens you're playing at. And if you want to play individual dudes, there is a game for it, I've recently discovered. But like in terms of a like you've said, like a 28 mil game that's like platoon down, I want a sprint, so to speak. And in the action economy of a game, it's cool to give the player these buttons to press, these things to do. You don't need to have more actions necessarily, but the actions you have need to be on that scale of value again, right? They need to be above 0, you know, to be valuable choices to be made, as opposed to just being these annoying maintenance actions that feel like they don't mean anything.
Well, yeah, as you say, like the lens of the game bears a lot in both expectation and what makes sense for the rule set. Yeah, I'm just trying to think if there's some other sort of unusual exception to that.
There's really cool, like Feng Shui. Like I've never played Feng Shui, sorry. But that has like the heavier you hit, the longer it's going to take for you to hit again. You know, like it's got that the chi based system, which is really neat, right? Like I think there's a cool like inhale exhale to that, which is really neat. But I would also say maybe my favorite activation system that's also the craziest one is probably RuneQuest. With the building up the steps, you know what I mean? And then you act based on what you've built up. So like if you move so far, that'll cost you so many steps of the 12 of the turn sequence. And then if you take your sword swing after that, you will have moved 8 on the turn sequence. Then you sword swing based on your stats or your weapon. Maybe that's a further 3. So you're not going till step 11 in the turn.
Yeah, I think a similar system to that is how, I can't remember what edition it is, but one of the versions of Alternity does that.
Yes, that's right.
It has 8 pieces to a turn, and certain actions are going to eat up. I think 8 is a big number, and for a game that is ostensibly a role-playing game, doing that kind of around-the-clock style play is a bit granular for most people.
Oh, yeah. It's niche.
I could appreciate that more if it was in more of a war or a skirmish game. I think I could get the idea, because it's supposed to map out the idea that if 2 characters want to coordinate their movements have to then map onto each other on this clock.
Yeah.
So like, I'm going to run over to that door and open it so that this guy can run through it while the guy behind him lays down cover fire. And that sounds like a really cool and complicated move. And it's neat that it has a system for handling that. But then there's so many things that have to go right for that to actually happen.
Yeah.
That's my general complaint with that system. I mean, we should do like a full review of it because it has the craziest dice resolution system.
Yeah.
Which I appreciate what it is, but it's also way too much. But also, yeah, the way that it handles its action sequence is very... it feels more appropriate for a tactical war game that has an extremely microed viewpoint as opposed to a role-playing game. Even just using individual, like we talked about, we were covering Warzone. A Warzone is just flat out action points. And it is a skirmish game, so it's reasonable to assume that. But then, yeah, different things that you do eat up a certain number of action points, usually 1. And as you move around, you expend those, and eventually your turn's over. And in fact, the wait action has to do with how many action points you've reserved and not used, which are then used against your opponent if you were to like effectively do what Overwatch does in other games.
Okay, here's a really interesting question too. We've talked about the potion free action. Overwatch as a free action is interesting.
So that's a reaction, I guess is what people would call that.
Yes, but do you like when reactions cost you future actions or are just free to be taken in the course of the opposing turn? Like, do you think there should be a tax on reactions, or do you just get them because the condition is met?
That's a good question, actually. I would say off the top of my head, I like when you have to leave yourself time to then react. So, and again, it's entirely a matter of terminology.
Right.
But one of the things that I do like about Warzone is that it calls Overwatch wait.
Right. Okay, cool.
It's not a declared thing, which in some ways makes sense. Maybe on a if you scoped up a bit, you want to have the idea that like, oh, we have a machine gun team. So that machine gun team needs to lay the gun down, point it at that direction, and say that we're overwatching this area.
That's like paying the tax up front, right?
It's funny because it's a semantic thing, but it's changing the context based around the idea that, like, I'm going to do nothing and react if I can, which is the idea of waiting and reserving action points in Warzone, but more down to the idea that we expect somebody to show up there, and so I can't just turn around and... bleh.
Right, exactly.
Depending on your weapon. Like, maybe a basic infantry could do that. Or maybe you just maybe you use the idea of the wait action and you just tailor the exception around something like an HMG or like a full machine gun.
Yeah, true.
sorry, an HMG would most of the time refer to like an anti-vehicle thing. But yeah, reactions. Reactions are an interesting one because I know that I don't know enough about the controversy in Dungeons and Dragons because I know there was something about reactions in 5th edition that there was a bit of a kerfuffle about.
I'm supposed to know how 5th edition works because I DM it a lot, but like I admit that like a lot of my DMing is very like from memory and improvisational. Like I'm pretty sure it worked like this. So I don't really know exactly what that controversy was either because I don't remember what it, like I don't know the specific trigger that it was that was so perhaps broken or exploitable. But I do like, for example, in a game where we're talking about actions taking place in an order of sequence, right? Where when this squad acts, it's assumed other squads are kind of like not inert in time, but they're almost not acting. I don't mind there being almost an infinite resource of reactions because it doesn't feel like it's all happening at once and it's impossible for them to have done that.
Right.
Like in my turn, say I have 4 sequential orders and that one squad reacts to 2 or 3 of them. That might make sense narratively or conceptually because these things are happening in an order. So those guys are just getting tired out maybe, but they're still participating in sequenced actions at the 20-second mark and the 40-second mark of this 1 minute run round the clock. In a lot of ways, have you ever played the PC game Combat Mission before?
I've seen it, but no, I've never played it.
So in that, it's a war game. It's World War II. I think there's other versions of it by now. I'm sure there is. But you move around platoons and squads and vehicles and junk. But the first phase is a map with your 3D models of your dudes. It's pretty rudimentary. But you move them around in a plotted, like, do this to get this far. And then you hit go. And then it becomes a simultaneous resolution where the moving parts, like, you know, those old football games, right? They just like vibrate and move towards each other. And then when they hit each other, stuff starts to blow up. But it's like in that, guys can only react to the specific series of things happening in that sequence of time in front of them because everything is simultaneous, as opposed to the notion that things might be falling like dominoes, where some events are occurring one after another, maybe not meant to be seen as literally happening in such a fashion, but for the purposes of the thought experiment of a war game or tabletop game, we just do it that way. And at the end of the turn, we can reverse rationalize how that might have, quote, really played out. But like for the purpose of actually getting through a turn meaningfully, everyone goes, we have 8 things that happen, my 4 and your 4. And I'm 1, you're 8. For example, right? And those do not overlap. Those are not at the same breath. Those are like at different points of the same time spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. And that's like probably the easiest way to look at it and maybe the cleanest. But like we've talked about in Battletech, there can be really cool advantages to when you are doing moments that are more simultaneously entwined.
Yep. No, that's true. And it adds a kind of immersion once you get your head into that space that this is, again, it goes back into more of that declarative thing. Like actually one question I had about your example that you gave is when you do that, is it entirely dictated on what your orders are or do the units have some level of autonomy?
In Combat Mission, yes, I believe there is like behaviors inherent to units as well. So like you can set them on a stance, like infantry, defensive stance, these woods, and they'll just like hold position and spit bullets at stuff, right? But there would be cases where if a unit goes to advance and hits a certain problem that they can't continue beyond, they won't just like, well, I guess we're told to keep running, you know, they'll like stop and set up and start fighting back, you know? And then if their morale changes, that will influence their behavior next as well. So there's a lot of different states and ticking over things that can happen in that. But that simultaneous sequencing creates a really, like, I've heard it described as a really forensic approach to a tactical game.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, because if it has things where they're like, let me put it this way, like if I can tell a unit that like setting priority as part of the tactical decision. So if you set the priority of moving between point A and point B as urgent, then they might not stop to shoot back while they get from point A to point B. But if you set it as defensive, then they might move, or tactical, they might move at a slower pace, but are then able to like stop, shoot back, and then eventually get to that point.
I'm certain that there's a lot of movement states in combat missions. I do remember that. I don't think I ever played version 2 of the engine. I think I only played the Western Front and the Eastern Front variations of the version 1 engine. So that's pretty old. But yeah, there were definitely these different states of movement. And if you went full out with your Sherman around the corner, it could just get smoked by a pack, because it would just come around the corner and drive fast towards an anti-tank gun that just has a target that's getting bigger for it, getting easier to hit as it comes into focus. So there's lots of things like that. But I don't know. There's a really crazy game I've always really wanted to play. I just haven't got there yet because we played Aliens and kind of before this one. So it's almost like we've touched on this. But I want to play Mothership.
Okay.
Because of that stress thing,
Yeah.
where like the players have a level of stress or panic that then caps off and limits the action economy. And I don't really know this. I've never played it. I haven't really read it from the GM perspective either. But I've read other people's plays of it, and it sounds like it's doing something in a reverse way as to what the Free League engine system's doing. Do you know what I mean? Where like you're adding more to the pot. This is like the inverse of that almost.
I know that stress in that game, as opposed to, say, Alien, is more punitive in some cases. It's a harder game.
Yeah.
In the sense that it begins to pull back the number of things that you can do, where the Free League game adds more dice with the possibility of failure attached to them. And the vanilla rules for Alien have it so that if like one of those turns up on a 1, you freak out. I have had mixed results running because it can turn into a comical, like a comedy of errors very quickly.
Yes.
Because a lot of those freak out effects freak out other people. And if you're all moving in a group, I mean, I like the dynamic that like there's a reason that you might not want to travel in a large group.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something more straightforward about Mothership again, I haven't played it. I've only read like playthroughs of how people have, like the experiences they've had. But I guess the idea is that as you play it and fear begins to set in or stress begins to mount, you become gradually more catatonic. Or at the very least, like there are involuntary actions, but it has more to do with this sort of stripping away of choices.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think it works in an indie game. I don't know that would be popular for the general audience, especially people who like progress and the ability to do a bunch of stuff, the heroic. But like for a horror game, totally makes sense. I mean, horror games are so different from adventure games.
Yeah, it's very true.
So much as they use the same mechanics, they may as well be classified with a totally different theme and assumption.
Yeah, totally.
You're not expecting to succeed. You're excited to see how you fail. You want to play it like you are going to win, right? Like you want to be sincere about the motivation. It's not like you're like, oh, what? But then it also lends this idea of, don't go into the basement. And it's like, well, and I also think this differentiates it from a survival game too. Sorry, just splitting hairs here and going off in a bunch of tangents. But so the difference between a survival game and a horror game is like, hey, maybe I do want to go into the basement because part of the fun is engaging with the horror element.
Yeah.
But then you do it in a sufficiently dramatic way so that it resembles something like a horror movie. Whereas a survival game, you're like, nope, just throw like Molotov cocktails down the stairs and burn everything in the basement. Even if it burns the house down, at least I can exit from here and not deal with the thing down there.
Yeah.
And Call of Cthulhu sometimes is either way about that, depending on how you play it.
It's so true. Depending on your GM, depending on the vibe you're going for in a game, it can really be either of those. I mean, as our friend and Call of Cthulhu GM Darren has said, the best one-shot in Call of Cthulhu ends with the mystery solved by the players, but everyone either dead or gone mad. And it's like, that's true. You want to get to the end of the story. You want to, I mean, it's almost weird. Could you think about action economy across an act structure instead of a turn structure? Like, is it like, I know we're getting close to the end here, so I don't want to like bust us open with a crazy new topic, but like the actions you take in an investigative game, like we do some investigation, which is then a bunch of sub actions that you have to spend your action economy on. But it's almost like a bigger sessional action economy that's going on, how you spend your blocks of like 45 minutes at the table with your other players.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only game that comes to mind that mechanically kind of operates like that is Fiasco.
Oh, true.
But it's a very loose game. But the idea that like effectively all the dice are rolled at the beginning, and then it's about this sort of careful or dramatic expenditure of this resource that's then predetermined.
Yeah, the cascade effect of the use of these dice at the moments that are most rewarding, maybe, for whoever wants to play them in such a way, right? Like sometimes it's funny.
Yeah, you're claiming and spending them. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. It can be all types of things, but I've had a lot of fun with Fiasco the few times I've played it. And you're right, like that's a cool action economy right there in itself.
But that is effectively like the entire game, the entire session, and thus the entire plot is made up of a single dice roll in some sense.
And I mean, people have done that in L5R. I know it. I've read people have done like one dice roll at a court, and that was the whole court scene that they just role played for 2 hours. Like, sure,
but that's like a single action, whereas this is one dice roll to determine the entire economy of the story.
Yes, that's different,
or at least the act, depending on how you're playing it.
Yeah,
right. So because you can return dice, and you can. There are times where there are rules that allow you to re-roll stuff, but like the gist of the game is that like this is what is going to be made up of this. Then players claim portions of that, spend them, pay them back in, and then sometimes they're re-rolled. And it's more about that expenditure, and the randomness is more like a setup.
Mm-hmm.
And so like if you roll all low numbers, then like it's going to be a very dicey session. Because you're only working between like 1s, 2s, and 3s.
It'll be an early Coen Brothers film instead of a late Coen Brothers film.
Exactly, right? Like, oh wow, things go really wrong really quickly, and then like everybody's at each other's throats, and it just spirals into nothing.
Yeah.
But then it could all be really high number, or mostly high numbers, and then be more drawn out. So like something of how the hand is pulled dictates the outcome. I don't know another game that does that. Because you're saying like L5R, you can, but that's more about scoping the action. That's more about saying that this one roll or this counter roll or different contributions to this single roll resolve this one scene in a particular way. But it's not like when we first start playing, we roll all of the dice and that's the whole game right there. It's more about how we spend it.
That's really unique in like every regard. It would be fun to use that in more, I mean, okay, sorry to be all over the place, but that's kind of how some of the divination magic works in D&D, where like you roll a couple of D20s at the start of your day, and you can attribute them to yourself or others in that day. And it's like, that's a magic, but it's kind of a neat idea to think of as like, you as a storyteller, as instead of a player character, and how would you assemble this in a different context of game other than like the hijinks of a Fiasco game? And I know there are Fiasco variants, but like that bears thought.
Yeah, well, and I mean, this is sort of tying into our episode about meta currencies and luck and stuff like that. But like Doom in Conan kind of works as kind of like that, but again, it's more of a point for point thing. But could you imagine a system where you like have, it's not necessarily the skill checks that the players are making, but there's this other thing that happens with this pool of dice that's rolled that then effectively the players can take from it, but then they end up giving something back to the GM to use against them later. That would be interesting. That'd be an interesting way for like the GM to manage the game. Would be to say the session is going to be, and then you throw a bunch of dice, kind of like that. And whether that's hidden behind the screen or out in the open, I think out in the open would probably be more engaging.
Yeah.
But the idea is like, this is your resource pool for this session, and I can pick from it too. So, and you don't have to use it, but ultimately it's going to get used up.
Yeah, 100%.
I don't know exactly how, like that's a very loose idea, but there's something interesting in that.
There really is. But I would say that's our top-down run-through on action economy as it applies to tabletop gaming, particularly TTRPGs and war games, with some consideration of board games. I think the things that I want to take away from this is that you can't overlook this aspect of a game's design. And every game uses an action economy. So consider it whether you're developing a game, when you're running a game, or whether you're just playing it. It's going to influence the entire experience. So whether your strategy or your pace, whatever, what we've talked about here today, it's going to be pretty much written out by the action economy before you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's an essential part of any game, and it's worth keeping an eye on it, because I think it's an easy way to tell whether a game is working or not, is whether its action economy feels satisfying or makes sense.
100%.
So yeah, that'll do it for us. What are we getting into next week?
So next week we're back with a role-playing game, Fabula Ultima. We're going to give a analysis, deep dive, and an overlook of this game that has been sort of an indie darling on Drive-Thru-RPG. People have really engaged with it by Need Games, and I'm very excited to give that a look, an analysis, and discussion of its themes and its relation to Japanese RPGs.
All right. Well, until then, happy gaming, and have a good one.
Have a good one.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.